Hi, everybody. Welcome to this webinar about Washington's economy for CCLI educators. If you don't know what CCLI is, don't worry about it. If you're an educator in Washington, you are welcome to watch this. If you're not in Washington, this won't be super helpful for you. My name is Jenny, and I'm going to be your guide for this presentation today. So let me tell you a little bit about what our job is when it comes to talking with students about jobs and the economy. It is not knowing every job, every salary, every industry, and all education required for our entire area. It's for sure not that. That's totally impossible. But it is knowing some of the basics and the value of different types of education and pathways so we can continue to learn as much as possible and even more importantly, support our students in finding the right path for them. We must also be aware of our own bias and challenge our own bias when we are talking about this with students. Really important. National data can be helpful, but what we really need to know is about what's happening in Washington State and in King County for those of you in King County. So national data, we're not going to look at that during this presentation today. We're just going to focus on Washington. And that's because we know that the majority of our students will not go more than 100 miles from where they graduate, at least here in Washington. So this is the context our students are going to be in and the one that we need to understand. We want our students to pursue their dreams and aspirations, and we also want to make sure we're giving them accurate information about the marketplace. These are both important. So we want our students to pursue their passions and do jobs that they love. We also want to make sure that they earn a living wage. And we want them to at least know what the realities are of wages in different types of careers. So that is really important as we go through today. What is a good job? You're going to hear me talk about good jobs a lot. A good job doesn't just mean money, but it's partly about money. So a good job, in my opinion, is one that pays a living wage. Otherwise, it's just not a good job, no matter how fun it is or how much we love it. And it's hard to love a job when you can't pay your bills. So we are going to be talking about both of these things in this webinar. The focus is going to be more on money and salaries and job opportunity and less on what students' aspirations are. And that is just because this is a place where at CCLI, we have heard folks want to have more information. When we get into the later part of this, where we're diving into talking about this with students, we will get into that more. But this first part is going to be more just about the reality of what our economy is. It's really important, and what we're doing here is knowing what's generally true, not just our personal experience or the people we know, people who might be in our family. This content is not something that I learned about in my school counseling program. It is probably not something you learned about in grad school or college. Maybe you did. If you did, that's awesome. But for the most part, we don't have very many opportunities to learn about this outside of our own experience. So that's what we're doing today. If you are from somewhere else in the country, somewhere else in the world, the economy where you're from might be different from what the economy is here. And we are really focusing on just how it is here, not how it is in other parts of the world or other states. Another note, if you are older than 35, like me, I'm 46, so I fall into this category. This would mean you graduated from college before 2008, most likely. Washington's economy has changed profoundly since you were a high school student and since you were a college student. In many ways, part of this is related to the recession, but it's also related to other types of technological change that are just as important as the recession. So keep that in mind. If you are older than 35, you came of age into a context that was very different from what it is now. Similarly, if you're younger than 35, so if you graduated from college since 2008, just be aware that your colleagues who are older have lived in a very different economy. And that is a reality that is going to impact all of you as you're doing your work. So finally, we're going to stick with real talk here about what's actually happening in Washington's job market and in Washington's economy, not what we want to be happening or we think could be happening. We're just going to stick to the facts and have curiosity about those. The invisible economy, I don't love that term. I kind of prefer the less visible economy. But the reason that this is considered invisible is that there are certain types of workers who are not counted in the data that we're going to look at. And it's just important to be aware of that because there are jobs that are not seen there that don't show up there. So, for example, many gig workers, you might have also heard the term 1099 workers. A 1099 worker is a person who is paid hourly as a contractor for a company or an organization, but is not an employee. So those of you who are part of CCLI, you may know that I have worked as a contractor for CCLI. I'm not an employee, or for CCR. I'm not an employee, and I get a 1099 form for taxes. So do Uber drivers, so do Amazon drivers, so do many consultants. And depending on how that person has their business set up, they may or may not be getting counted in this data. Some people are and some people aren't. It depends on how they're receiving that 1099 and some other things that you probably don't care about. Similarly, some undocumented people are not being counted in this data. Some undocumented people are being counted in this data. So just be aware that that could go either way. And again, much of that depends on their personal situation and what types of work permit they may or may not have. So you don't need to worry too much about those details. Just know that. Also, YouTubers, influencers, other types of online businesses, bloggers, some folks are not being counted here. Some are. Again, it depends entirely on how they have their business set up with the IRS. And there are multiple ways to do it that are completely fine. You kind of have to work out with your accountant what the best strategy is for you. So I just want to make you aware that there are a lot of people working in these types of jobs. There are a lot of undocumented people in Washington. Some of these folks are captured in this data and some of them are not. So just be aware that that is a little bit of a limitation about what we're talking about today. All right. Before we look at any more information, I want to just add a really important note about the history of racism in the United States. And this long history of racism combined with structural economic change has heightened advantages held by white workers over Black and Latinx workers and other people of color. It doesn't have to be this way. This is what has been happening. And part of the reason it's so exciting for us to learn about this is that part of our role as educators is to disrupt this and bring increased opportunity to students of color, both in education as well as in knowledge about job opportunities and careers. Today, right now in 2022, white workers are more likely to have a living wage job than Black or Latinx workers at every level of educational attainment. So this is something that is pervasive, and part of our job is to help turn this around. And one way we do that is by educating ourselves. So that's what you're all doing here. So great job. All right. Fun thing, I was talking about the importance of 2008 for many reasons. Some jobs have disappeared since then. Some jobs that a lot of people had. Blockbuster franchise owner, car assembly manual part loader. That is a job that is now done by robots that used to be done by people. Film projectionist. It was around the late 2000s when digital film fully took over, and the person whose job it was in a movie theater to move the films from one thing to another, that job went away. And similarly, there are some jobs that exist now that didn't exist in 2008. A few of those, and there are a lot, and I'm sure you can think of many more. One is a social media manager. That is now an excellent job that many people have. And people work for large corporations, people work in small businesses, people freelance as social media managers. There are lots of ways to do this, but that is an excellent job that did not exist in 2008. Similarly, a Lyft driver or other types of driving and delivery jobs that there have always been delivery jobs, but not necessarily ones like Lyft, what consistent driving jobs. A couple others in tech, cloud architect. So in 2008, things were not stored in the cloud on the same way that they are now. So the folks who manage that on the tech side, the hardware side, that is an excellent job that didn't used to exist. And another one is an artificial intelligence engineer. So a person who is like a software engineer, but specializes in artificial intelligence. This is one of the highest paying jobs that is available in our region right now. And it is essentially a software engineer who's highly specialized in AI. And you may see AI poking up more and more. And that is a field that is growing rapidly right now. In addition to jobs that went away, jobs that have shown up, there are some jobs that have been very transformed since 2008. And some of these, even much more recently than that, like teaching. Obviously, teaching really has changed in the last couple years. That's not the only change, but learning to teach on Zoom, that sort of thing, huge shift. So there's been a similar, even more profound shift in medicine where all record keeping has shifted to electronic. And there are many things that go along with that. That's been a big transition over the last 10 years. And in addition, journalism and music. You've heard people say that journalism is dead. That for sure doesn't seem to be true to me, but journalism has massively transformed. Instead of just like working at the paper and writing away on your stories, you might be running your own website, you might be freelancing, you might be doing social media. There's lots of ways in which journalism has changed, largely around it moving to an online world primarily. And finally, another example is music. Used to be you could not do anything unless you had a record label. But now people are able to get off the ground using YouTube and other free resources, which is a pretty cool transformation to me. And again, you can probably think of many other examples of this. Okay, the next section, we're going to talk about the top 7 employers in Washington state. This data is accurate as of June 2021. I doubt it's changed a whole lot since then, but it's possible that it could have. So when we're doing this live, we're going to have people guess what they are. I'm not going to do that in this recording because that would just be you waiting for me to move on. So instead, we're just going to go ahead and move on and talk about this. Now, in a couple minutes, we're going to get into into industries in Washington. And this is just employers. And the reason we want to look at both of those is that there are some industries that don't have big, giant employers and then others that do. So this will help us get a more complete picture of what's going on with jobs and where people work in Washington state. All right, so number 1 is Amazon. Now, a lot of people, when I've talked about this with them recently, have guessed Amazon. But the thing that is really interesting about Amazon is that they have only been our top employer since the pandemic started in 2020. In 2020, Amazon's revenue increased dramatically, and they currently employ over 80,000 people. I'm sure it's even more now because this data is about 9 months old at the time that I'm recording this. So this was a 25% increase from 2019. So in 2 years, they had a 25% increase in their employees, which is sort of mind-boggling. I mean, that is really a huge growth. So Amazon is the biggest employer in Washington state. The second one might come as a little bit of a surprise. The second one is the US military. This includes both active duty military as well as civilians who work directly for the military. The reason normally active duty military are not counted in employers, but the reason that I am counting this is because this is a lot. What we're looking at here is where are people working in Washington? That's what we really care about as educators. And active duty military members are not technically considered residents of the state where they are currently based, but these are folks whose children are in our schools and who may be going to college on the GI Bill um in our state and are members of our community. So I think it's really important that we name this as and get a sense of how most people especially in the Seattle area, are pretty shocked to find out the massive impact of the military here. And there's a lot. So there are more active duty military members in Washington state than Boeing employees. Um, Important thing to know. About 40,000 civilians work for the military in Washington. And also, there are about an additional 26,000 people working for the federal government in other sectors. So mostly we're talking about the military here. Um, and most of the jobs are at Joint Base Lewis McChord, which is between Tacoma and Olympia. So for those of you in King County, we don't feel the impact of JBLM the way that folks in Tacoma and Olympia do. But there are a lot of retired military people in King County. Also, the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard in Bremerton, which again is across the water from us, but that is another place where a lot of people are employed. All right, number 3 is the Washington state government, which employs more than 67,000 people. It does not include public colleges and universities. So when I say Washington state government, this is people working directly in state agencies, not people working at any public college or university, which is important because that's going to come up later. There are roles in state government from management, law enforcement, park rangers, highway maintenance, engineering. There is a wide variety of jobs in government. Number 4 is Boeing. For a long time, Boeing was the largest employer in Washington state for a couple of decades. And right now, they employ 20% fewer people than in 2019. Much of this is contributed to problems at Boeing before the pandemic, including the mess with the 737 MAX. So it didn't help that the pandemic came along and decimated travel and airlines ordered fewer aircraft during that time. That didn't help, but that is not the only factor that led to fewer employees at Boeing. Despite that, Boeing is still a huge employer in Washington, especially in King County and Snohomish County. And Aerospace overall is a major employer in Washington. We'll get to that when we get to industries, but just know that it's not just Boeing. There are people who don't work at Boeing, but who work in aerospace, and many of those jobs are in King County and Snohomish County. Number 5, Microsoft. Microsoft employs about 50,000 people in Washington, and they're part, as you know, of the large and very fast-growing tech sector. There are many employers in that sector, not just Microsoft and Amazon, which we'll get to more when we get to industries. Number 6 is the University of Washington, which has more than 35,000 employees. And more than half of those folks work in UW medicine. So one thing that gets a little tricky when you look at employers is like the University of Washington. Is that education? Is it state government? Is it healthcare? Right? So that's why we're also looking at industries. But just so you know, one of the reasons why the University of Washington is such a large employer is because of the very large network of UW medicine clinics and the hospital. Number 7 is another big healthcare company. It's called MultiCare. It's based in Tacoma, but they have expanded statewide. I know there is MultiCare in Spokane. And so those of you who live in South King County may be more familiar with MultiCare, especially if you live in Tacoma. They employ a lot of people also. All right, so industries. Now we're diving into not employers, but industries that employ people. And I'm sort of putting these mostly in order of the number of jobs they provide in our state, but that is a little bit squishy and a little bit hard to figure out exactly because, for example, Alaska Airlines. Is Alaska Airlines in travel? Is it in tourism? Is it in transportation? Is it a tech company? Is it there's a lot of different categories you could put a company like Alaska Airlines into, and the different jobs at Alaska Airlines would go into kind of different buckets. So this is why we're kind of looking at it by industry as well as employers. And all of this data, by the way, comes from the Washington Department of Commerce, which is kind of a fun and slightly weird website to dig into if you want to geek out on this stuff. So, number one, by far, the largest industry in Washington is this intersection of healthcare, biotech, and global health. This has a lot of overlap with the tech industry. I want to just say that up front. It's really difficult to add up the total number of jobs and the amount of money involved in this because it's massive, but it's bigger than tech. It's bigger than anything else. So, although, like I said, there is some crossover with tech for sure. That we have in Washington State, most of these are in King County, 170 global health organizations. So this includes the Gates Foundation, but there are 169 others. There's also a lot of research that happens. So this is not just people going to the hospital or going to see their doctor or having cancer screenings. This also includes global health. It includes research. Fred Hutch, the UW, and WSU, and many other organizations, but those three are at the top, are doing a lot of research in healthcare, in treatments, in many things. There are a lot of startups, a lot of venture capital in Washington related to this industry. We have had from companies in Washington and organizations in Washington 8 Nobel Prize winners in the sciences, which is pretty cool. It also includes biodevices. And the reason I wanted to mention that specifically is that is really also tech, right? So, biodevices would be things that are used in healthcare, but are really tech products. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about where it gets a little bit blurry of figuring out what goes in what bucket. The second one, of course, is tech. That is probably not a surprise. There's over 300,000 jobs in tech. I am sure it's vastly more than that. This information is a few months old. I am sure it has grown massively since then. Over the last 10 years, jobs in tech in Washington, now we're talking about just here, we're not even talking about other parts of the country, have grown 34%. That's pretty big. And the rate of growth has been accelerating. So, like in the last 2 years, it's gone up a ton, much faster. It's around $104 billion industry annually. I don't even know how to wrap my head around what that means, but there it is. Tech workers make up about 11% of Washington's workforce. And in King County, that number is higher. So I don't know exactly what it is for King County. We could figure that out together when we get to the next section, but it's a lot. There's quite a bit of overlap in tech with both aerospace and healthcare. Let's keep that in mind. Some of the biggest employers, this is by no means all of them, but some of the big tech companies in Washington are Amazon and Microsoft, which we already talked about, as well as Expedia, Google, Facebook, and Tableau. Again, there are many others. Almost all of these offices are in Seattle or Bellevue. Not all, but the majority. So this is very local to the greater Seattle area in King County. Number 3 is aerospace. This has, in the past had almost as many, well, in the way past, it had more jobs than tech, but it wasn't that long ago that aerospace was just as big as tech. This includes not only air travel, so Boeing, Alaska Airlines, that sort of thing. But it also includes space exploration and defense. There are a lot of defense contractors in Washington, and both Blue Origins and SpaceX have jobs in Washington state. I actually didn't know that before doing this research, so that's kind of cool. There's a lot of overlap in the aerospace industry with both manufacturing and tech. Washington State is number one in aerospace sales and exports. The top state in the whole country. A lot of people think it's California, but it is not. It's Washington. Boeing and Honeywell are also pretty big aerospace and defense companies as well. All right, number 4 is tourism. And this one is kind of a sleeper because in tourism, there aren't any massive employers here. Sure, we do have some large hotel chains. We have 3 cruise companies that are headquartered in Seattle. So those are bigger employers, but they're still very small compared to like Amazon or Boeing, or even state government. But there are lots of small businesses in tourism, and there are lots of jobs in tourism, and they are spread out all over the state. Every single county in Washington has jobs in tourism, including King County. And it's the 4th largest industry in Washington. And one thing that I find really fascinating about it is, well, of course, we have lots of international visitors, lots of people from other parts of the country. 2/3 of the tourism in Washington state is from people in other parts of Washington state. So a family from Seattle going to Leavenworth for the weekend, or the Olympic Peninsula, or Spokane, or a family from Spokane going skiing at White Pass, something like that. So that's kind of interesting. We have a lot of local tourism in Washington state. It's also a year-round industry. A lot of times people think of it as just summer, but it is a big industry year-round with skiing and many other things. Seattle is known as a place you can visit year-round. And those of us who live in Washington might not think Seattle is that fantastic to visit in January. But if you walk around downtown, you will definitely see that there are tourists there, even in January. So it's kind of fun. Number 5 is agriculture and food production. And for those of you, again, the primary audience for this, you're in King County. So if you think that this is only in Eastern Washington, I want to just say right now that is not true. Yes, there is a lot of food production and agricultural jobs in Eastern Washington for sure. Washington is the number 1 producer of apples, blueberries, hops, and cherries in the United States, and the number 2 producer of many other things, including apricots and asparagus. But King County and Western Washington also have a lot of agriculture jobs. There are a lot of jobs in the wine industry. There are a lot of jobs in seafood production, which we're the second biggest state that produces seafood after Alaska, which is probably not a surprise. We're a big wine producer, the second state after California. But also here in Western Washington, Darigold, Full Circle, and Wilcox Farms are all King County. In King County. Treetop is in Wenatchee, but it's a big employer also, and they make juice and applesauce and things like that. Number 6 is military and defense. This has a lot of overlap with aerospace, but not completely. I mentioned that there are a lot of active duty military in Washington state, but also lots of defense contractors, lots of civilian contractors, and we have 9 different military installations. For those of you in King County, we aren't as closely touched by that, even though we have the military all around us in Kitsap County, in Pierce County, in Oak Harbor, many places directly around us. But if you're in Seattle or close to Seattle, you may not see this as much as people do in Snohomish County, Pierce County, Thurston County, Kitsap, that sort of thing, or Eastern Washington, Spokane, and Richland. Okay, number 7, Maritime. This is another sleeper, a little bit like tourism, in that there are not super huge employers in the maritime industry, but there are a lot of jobs, 70,000. These ones are mostly, as it would make sense, in Western Washington, but all up and down the coast in Washington. So there are jobs in Maritime on the Olympic Peninsula, in Seattle, in Everett, in Bellingham, in Olympia. There are quite a few. So, a few fun facts about the maritime industry. A quarter of the shipyards in the US are in Washington state. Shipyards, if you don't know, is where ships are built and or repaired. So that is a big industry here. We are also the largest producer of hatchery and farmed shellfish, not fin fish like salmon, but farmed shellfish. So like oysters, clams, mussels, that kind of thing. Penn Cove on Whidbey Island, which is produces mussels, is one of the largest mussel producers in the world. There's also lots of other shellfish all up and down the coast. And a final fun fact is that we are the fourth largest container gateway in North America. And this is kind of a combination of the Port of Seattle and Tacoma. They actually, despite competition in the past, do kind of work together around managing the container travel, the shipping containers and travel, and all the logistics associated with that in North America. Number 8, forestry. This is a much smaller employer than it was back in the day. Back in the earlier days of statehood, forestry was one of the primary industries here. That is no longer true, but it's still up there. It's still top 10, number 8. Washington is the second largest producer of lumber in the United States. Probably, if you've lived here any amount of time, you've heard of Weyerhaeuser, a big logging and forestry company that's also very involved in home building and development now, by the way, more in the last couple decades. Also, state and local government have a ton of jobs in forestry. The federal government does as well, but there are a lot of jobs working for the state of Washington or counties or cities around forestry and forest health and that sort of thing. All right. So that is the basics, our top 8 of the industries we have in Washington, along with the biggest employers in Washington. So a couple more slides and then we're going to wrap up this section. So the magic comes for us as educators when the economy lines up with what students want to do. So when you live somewhere where there is an awesome job market with really high paying jobs for aerospace engineers, for example, or computer science majors. I meant to say software engineers is what I meant to say. If a student really wants to do that, I mean, that is awesome because there are tons of high paying jobs like that in our region. When it's a little bit harder is when students want to do something like being a chef that is not a super high paying job. And that's just the way it is. But I think it's really important when we're talking to students that we talk about both. It's like, hey, we want you to understand kind of what the job market is like in this field, but we also want you to do what you want. And we really want to encourage students to explore because while some high school students know exactly what they want to do, I think we all know that is not the majority. Most people are like, I don't know. So most people are going to be pretty open-minded to learning information about what their options are. All right. Another thing, again, this may not be true everywhere, but it is for sure true here. Most living wage jobs, not all, but most, in Washington state require some kind of post-secondary education after high school. So going back to the example I gave before, of course, if you're going to be a software engineer, that requires a 4-year degree. Some software engineers also go to grad school. If you want to be a knee surgeon, you're going to need to do college and medical school and residency. If you want to be an electrical line worker, you get trained on the job, but you still have to go through training, and it's very competitive. If you want to work in tourism, most people working in tourism have some kind of training. It may not be a 4-year degree, it might be, but it also might be a degree in hospitality. But I can tell you for sure, I've worked in tourism for a couple decades, and the jobs, in order to make anything like a living wage in tourism, you definitely need an education. Otherwise, you get the really low paying jobs. So there are lots of ways in which this plays out. I want to make it very clear that I'm saying some kind of post-secondary education. Many require 4-year degrees, but not all. And sometimes people think, oh, well, I don't need a 4-year degree, so I don't need anything. So I want to just make you aware that for most of these jobs and industries we've been talking about, maybe it's an apprenticeship. Maybe you can do it with a 2-year program. Maybe you need a 4-year degree. This is a way to engage with students around their post-secondary options, but being aware that especially if they're going to take a pathway that doesn't require a 4-year degree, making sure they know what it does require and they're ready to sign on for that is super important. All right. We saw this slide earlier, but as we're wrapping up, I just want to mention this again, that it's not our job to know everything. It isn't. That's not possible. We don't need to do that. It is our job to know the basics, to know the value of different types of pathways and what that can lead to in general.